I think the important thing to start with, who saw PPD's Twitter today?
When the Faceit admins are writing Valve and saying, should we disqualify this team at this point in the TI qualifiers?
Doesn't really take much away from TI being, the crown jewel and the grand prize. It's still going to be there.
Welcome everyone to our extension of the Rivalry Cooldown. And so with us on the show, you just saw them in a 2-hour-long episode, and here they are again, Nahaz and KBBQ, or Jack, because that's a little less of a tongue twister. Welcome, guys.
Hey, thanks for bringing us on again.
Indeed.
Good to.
I can't believe you keep signing up for this, Nessa.
Had someone on Reddit say, wow, Nahaz has had 100% attendance so far. And I was like, you know, I'm okay with that.
It's the only perfect attendance award I've earned in my lifetime, I think.
We can keep that going. All right, so you guys have had a few days to ruminate on our episode. Do you feel like we left anything out? You got another like 6 hours in you, right?
Oh, easily. No, I have to leave eventually because I have to run a review session tonight for my Port Intermediate Micro students who have their final exam on Wednesday. So, no, I bet that's like hours away. Yeah. If we're still going by then, I'll be mildly surprised.
Yeah, that would certainly be impressive. Okay, I think we're not even going to let it be an elephant in the room. I think the important thing to start with, who saw PPD's Twitter today?
No, hell with that. The important thing to start off with is the Battle Pass is coming out tomorrow, so we got to talk about all this shit now because tomorrow we're going to be playing Dota.
All right, accurate. You're right. Tomorrow's all going to be about the points. But I think a topic I saw brought up in chat a couple of times came up in my own Discord. I've seen a lot of people asking it, so I'm going to be selfish and start our AMA there because it's what I'm interested in. PPD, for those of you who didn't see it, has basically been tweeting that if Chaos wins, I think their best of 1 and their best of 3, they'll get a huge jump in DPC points and probably make it to TI, which means a second South American team will make it, and we know how PPD feels about South America. And this sort of sparks the question of, what do we think about team owners and teams that have a majority of players or a significant amount of players not from the actual region they're competing in? Because we've seen some mixed messaging on Valve from this front that has definitely been a question in the DPC in regards to when NIP wanted to play South America and Valve said no, but then EG is playing North America.
All right. So can I kind of point of order, all right?
Uh-huh.
I would prefer to separate this into 2 separate discussions because I personally read Peter's tweet as not being about players from whatever region.
I agree. I think it raised that question. I think this was more about how dumb the point spread is.
As I think SA sucks and they shouldn't have 2 teams at TI.
Yeah.
And this DPC system sucks therefore. And I would like to respond to that before we get into the whole, because honestly, look, the whole regional identity and players in the region, like you could bring up that issue with Complexity, who just had a really nice win today at MDL Disney. That's a wider issue. I tweeted back, Loda had responded. Peter has his thoughts, and we all sort of learned to control for the PJ Salt. Loda, though, responded saying he agreed with Peter, and I felt the need to respond at that point, disagreeing with the both of them. And so I kind of want to go on that topic first, and then we can cover players. Is that?
Yeah. Okay, so we're starting on South America sucks.
Okay.
So the DPC is clearly messed up if they're making it.
So, yeah, let me have a mini rant about that first, because there are a lot of things I think, esports fans, some esports fans are like new to competitive world. I mean, I have been watching traditional sports for years, and so I bring with me all of the prejudices and the sort of habits from traditional sports like the NBA, the NFL, and college, whatever. A lot of people obviously are coming from different backgrounds. So, for example, there was an OWL thing a while back where like OWL had their first off-site games out of LA games in Dallas, and there was sort of this mini controversy where the home crowd fans actually booed the away team, and some people got like triggered by this, and I was like, really? I mean, it's, we're sort of mimicking stadium sports in North America, and we're surprised when the away team gets booed. This to me is kind of the same thing, because yes, I know we all they always sell the events by saying, oh, it's the best two teams playing in the Super Bowl, or the best however many teams competing in the Major League Baseball playoffs, or the best two teams in the It's never the best two teams. It's never. It's the best team from the Eastern Conference against the best team in the Western Conference. It's the best AFC team against the best NFC team. It's the best in football. It's the division champions again, and however many wild cards per conference. It's never the best X teams. It's always the best X teams subject to some restrictions, like who's in what conference or like who's in what region. So I don't understand the whole we want the best. No, sports has never worked like that. And I think it's the tournament is called, as I responded to Loda and Peter, the tournament is called the International. It's not called the EU and China Invitational. And, a big goal of the tournament is supposed to be to promote Dota 2 around the world, and Dota 2 in all of the regions in which it's played. If anything, I'm kind of on board with Knoxville that we should make more of an effort to expand the number of regions over time, not less. And the other thing that always triggers me come TI team is that come TI time is people act like who the best 16 teams are is somehow blatantly obvious.
Yeah, and everyone has their opinion.
OG was the best team last year. Give me a break. I mean, I don't look. I think, contrary to some public spats that we've had, I agree with Peter on most things Dota. I agree with Loda on virtually everything Dota, but I don't agree in this particular case. I think saying that we're going to have at least one and possibly two SA representatives is fine, and I think if anything, I think it's more egregious that we've had, 3 NA slots for some of these majors, but I don't even have, that big a problem with that compared to a lot of people either.
Well, so here's a question I have for Jack, because we're talking about booing at these Overwatch events and comparing to stadiums. If you're in TI, how many USA chants do you have? And what is that the anti-China atmosphere of TI, right? Like every single other person bans against that one section of the crowd. Like we know that happens. We all acknowledge it. And I want to know the other side of the pond, the other side of the world, whatever you want to refer to it.
Doesn't have to be the other side of the world. How about we talk about Vancouver last year?
Yeah, well, I mean when Trent came out in the hockey jersey
last year on finals day was not exactly that was not an anti-China crowd, guys.
I'm just curious, what is it like from the Chinese point of view? Do they have the same? Because there's definitely in the West there is a very strong everyone beats down on Chinese teams because they've been good for so long. So when they're not good, you jump on the opportunity. And there's a very clear East versus West rivalry. I mean, we've built that up in TI for years. So I'm curious what the Chinese perspective is on booing and, getting behind your teams and everything like that. And which regions suck? Which regions do China not want to have slots?
Well, you just asked me a lot of different questions at once. I mean, it's a complicated issue. I think obviously, up till this year, every TI has been in North America. Obviously, I think disproportionately, there's a lot of either Chinese fans or players, or Chinese exchange students. If you're talking about in Seattle or Vancouver, that make up a large portion of the live crowd. So it's not so cut and dried, but there's just so many examples that come to mind that need to be taken more carefully. Like for instance, teams chanting USA for when Navi is out there, right? Because they're playing against a Chinese team, or kind of this controversy about teams not supporting their teams that are from a different region, things like that. I think kind of what Nahaz says, a part of that should be expected. Like you're going to support your hometown or home nation or whatever it is teams over others. It's also very dangerous to generalize in any of these situations. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of Chinese fans who like a lot of foreign teams and players and would cheer for them. And then there are many of them that don't, or don't much care for foreign teams. I think that's the same way. I think that's the same phenomenon that happens everywhere. I don't think that that's specific to any region or area. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Is there a PPD of China? And does China hate Southeast Asia like North America seems to hate South America? If we were to generalize. I'm just generalizing with the PPD, you know, with the years of documented SA salt.
I think to some extent there's probably a bit of a little bit. I mean, it depends. I just think that those two scenes are still relatively, to Dota 2, they're still relatively new, and they're still like growing and developing, and so they haven't been like the traditional powers, I would say, in the region. And so because of that, you know, people just don't think that they're any good, and they don't respect them for that reason. But obviously, like, you know, with each year, with each tournament, with each competition, you're starting to see that be less and less of the case.
Jack, do you think that there's the unique thing about PPD is that not only is he a very visible personality in the community, but he also has Valve's ear. Like, that's a thing. Do you think that there's any one personality in China that is both that visible and that has Valve's attention to the same extent?
Not to the same degree. I mean, there are a lot of very vocal members of the community, but I think there's still no one that has the kind of unique combination of outspokenness and stature, and achievement, and also in a sense, like, hey, he's like NA's pride in a way, right? Like, he's part of the only NA team to have won TI. Like, obviously, like, you know, like Valve is based in NA. Valve has people who can more easily talk to him and associate with him, and, you know, have conversations with him. So I think that's the part of that is kind of natural. So there's probably isn't anybody who was outspoken and influential to the same degree, especially in those eyes. But there's a lot of people, obviously, whose words have a lot of influence over there. So the other thing about Peter is he doesn't really. I mean, he makes clear kind of which things he likes and dislikes, but he also doesn't really pull punches on stuff. Like, he kind of just if there's something that he thinks is wrong or doesn't, he'll just say it. So that's something that people generally respect about him, or at least like, because they don't think that he's just, you know, fixated on things that benefit him or have to do with it.
Well, but let's be real, he does. I mean, Peter is not a benevolent dictator, but he has made it, and I like the guy, and he's made it very smartly a part of his brand, that when he's got a chip on his shoulder about something, you're gonna hear about it. And I don't think, like, that's the thing. I don't think I would have a problem. I'm going to go ahead and say that I would have a problem with Peter if he represented himself as some kind of DPC commissioner or ambassador of the game. I don't think he does. I think Peter's very open about the fact that he's got opinions, and his opinions are mostly about stuff that affects him. It's fine.
And we've talked about that in cooldowns before.
Other than what he is, and that's a smart guy who's trying to make a living in the scene and who happens to be really smart and have opinions.
Okay, so I'm going to take a question from chat now so that you guys know that we're paying attention to you.
We are.
Like a proper AMA. That was my selfish question to get out of the way and make sure we're talking about it. So Funk Doctor says, do you think teams competing in closed quals should be required to have some sort of written legal agreement before they're allowed to compete? Even just an assertion of who owns the team, are players employees, or that everyone has equal stakes?
Emphatically, yes. I think that's one of the many. When I get on these rants about DPC rules, I am not just talking about the fact that we don't have a full and complete written rule set, that rulings are made and punishments are handed out based on people's recollection of what was verbally said at a players meeting, and with millions of dollars on the line. I think that's unconscionable. I also mean, I do think that every player and every organization that's competing in a DPC event should be signing a contract for that event and saying, look, here you go. I've signed on the dotted line. This is what I'm attesting. And I think that at least a large portion of that contract should be front facing. I think we should all be aware of what's in those. again, though, that's one of the flaws that I've had every iteration of Valve systems. The one criticism that I think I've levied at every single one of them has been a lack of transparency.
And so there's a good question for Jack, actually, I think that we can extrapolate there, is obviously this question is going to originate from the Beast Coast team, etc. things. If a team were to be given the choice of you have to keep your roster the same, say we're heading into TI, you have to keep your roster the same, you cannot change any players, or you change players but you have to go back through, the open qualifiers. And I think we already know the answer to this because we've seen it before. But if Valve had gone to team and said, sorry, you can't play in this major if you make these changes, what do you think Envy would have, from the player perspective, what do you think the choice there would have been?
I think if they knew that in advance and they had to make that choice, then I think they would have chosen to play. Because for sure, because ultimately, even if you don't have faith in those people or whatever, you still want to play because you have a chance and you have a way to showcase yourself to other people on the biggest stage. So I think they would undoubtedly have chosen to play if they were given that choice.
I mean, it got them a sponsorship, right?
Yeah,
I think in this case, part of the problem is, right, and I mean, I think Jack can speak to this too, that it's not one of the reasons that this is a little bit more complicated than that question would suggest is it's not always up to just one organization or one group of people. That sometimes, you go back to some of the old EG secret situations, EG OG last year, sometimes, we had two players depart because they got up to another team. They got off to another team. It's not up to us anymore. So what do you do then, right?
Well, and that's my follow-up question is what if Valve came back and said, sorry, team, you have to play with Gunnar and Nusham, right?
Well, again, I think in this situation, that could have been done, and I think a lot of people on Reddit especially would tell you that should have been done. I think that's problematic as a general rule, though, again, because it's not always up to just one team, and you're going to get situations where 3 or 4 people are going to tell you, hey, yeah, we would love to be able to play with that one person, but he doesn't want to play with us, or he can't for some reason. Go all the way back to Era at TI4, I believe it was, right? I mean, and Fnatic.
That was a very complicated, because if I recall correctly, Era wanted to play, and Fnatic said, no, it's not good for you.
I don't mean to, I like it.
I
know Adrian personally, I like him a lot. I don't want to get too far into that, but here's the thing. We're in this situation the last 2 years because people didn't like those roster locks. Okay. People didn't like these, you're locked to your team except for predefined periods during the season. And they certainly didn't like it in the first iteration where, because of the proximity of the Manila Major to TI, you had a many-month roster locking period. And that's fine. So we wanted to have flexibility through the season. Last year, we had points accrue to players. People didn't like that because they were concerned about organizations buying players from other teams to somehow get their way into TI. All of those, there's actually really not that realistic a scenario where that would happen. And so this year we end up with the system where points accrue to teams, but that's potentially to the detriment of players getting kicked and creates all kinds of problematic incentives. I actually think, I don't mind roster locks. Roster locks in the sense of, I do think there should be a rule that if you earned your spot at the major with a particular set of 5 players, and those 5 players all want to play for you.
And it was not established that someone was a stand-in during qualifiers, because that has happened.
That's kind of where I'm at, right? That if all 5 players were on your DPC roster as of the qualifiers, and that group of 5 not designated as stand-ins, and if all 5 of those players say, yes, we want to play for a major, I think you ought to have that same group of 5 players. Now, the problem with doing that this year is because of the timing of the qualifiers, because for largely, I believe, and have been told, due to visa issues, they decided to have the qualifiers well in advance of the actual DPC minor and major. And so if you do that this year, that would practically become a roster lock system. You would end up with teams roster locked for long periods of time in very short windows, if any, for some of these events. Remember, opens are taking place in some cases while the current major is underway. So I think part of this begins with, I don't want to go, I have some ideas about this and how you could do it. And it all gets back to things need to be planned a lot farther in advance. But I think if you do the best you can to address the visa situation as much as you can at the beginning of the season, then you have a lot more flexibility in terms of having these qualifier dates closer to the actual DPC events and being able to write policy along the lines of, look, you can do whatever you want with your roster all season long. We'll find some way to tweak the point calculations vis-a-vis roster changes, but we also expect that if you play a qualifier, I mean, a lot of organizers do this anyway. ESL has done this in the past where, basically you say, look, if you've got a group of 5 players that plays a qualifier and earn their spot and you haven't designated as stand-ins and those 5 players want to play at the LAN,
you got to keep the team. So that interesting segue into Drag and Drop's question here, because I don't know if you guys would even agree with it. So Drag and Drop says, what do you guys think needs to happen for Valve to change their focus, to care more about the ecosystem as a whole versus focusing mostly on players? What would be required for them to implement the necessary changes to the DPC? So there's a few things to unpack here, but the first one would be, do we think that the current DPC is focusing entirely on players? And I think what Drag and Drop is getting at is that the ecosystem potentially isn't great for talent. It isn't great for getting new players in. It's really only focused on the pros, which I could get behind, but I'm not sure I agree that the DPC is focused on being healthy for pro players. So my question would be, I suppose the question we'll take from all of that is, do you think the current DPC ecosystem focuses on pro players? And if not, what does it focus on?
You go ahead first with this one, Jack.
I think compared to other games, Dota's traditionally been very player focused. Mm-hmm. Like they have a lot of autonomy, they have a lot of power. I think generally things have been sided with them over orgs. And it does make sense in a lot of ways, but I think when you start to run into some issues is if the incentives of the rest of the ecosystem are not really accounted for, and if the players whose input is being most valued and most acted upon is like a fairly small segment of players, right? Like if you're going to the influential players, the people who have won a TI, or the people who have like a large stake in the scene and who in a sense, since their position is almost unassailable or guaranteed, I think that's when you might start to run into questions, because now you're not even considering the other pool of players. I think that's, I mean, it's a very broad issue and I'd have to come up with a lot of specific examples. But
that was the number one point, really, when you asked that question and the way it was asked. That was the number one point that I wanted to make, was that, a lot of people look at the Dota ecosystem and say that it's very player centered. And I think that's fine. I think that there, like anything else, there are advantages and disadvantages to running a system that way. But I think you have to amend. It's player centered, but for practical purposes, it very often, at least in respects to a lot of decisions, ends up being centered around the will of a relatively small group of very powerful players, with the rest of the organizations and the rest of the players getting heard only occasionally, most of the time only at TI. So again, the other thing that I remind people of is, I've been around the scene for a while now, and I've met a lot of these guys, and even coached a few of them. But these are our players are very, very smart, and they're exceptional. They're exceptional guys by and large. They're also mostly 20-year-olds, and 20-year-olds overreact to shit and they get emotional about stuff.
And they're not going to sign contracts because people are going to think they're focusing on the wrong thing.
And so that's the thing that there's, it is not as, that's part of the problem is I would be a lot more in favor, not that I'm not in favor now, but I would be a lot more in favor of an expressly player-centric system if there were a centralized players organization where all players had some equity and there were leaders, but those leader players were also being advised by people that had a holistic view of the scene and were looking at, okay, what's it going to take not only to make you happy now, but what's it going to take for the competitive ecosystem to remain happy and you to keep getting these opportunities. That's where I would feel like the system is player-centric now, but it's not as if all voices get heard, and it's not as if the long view always gets taken. And that's kind of it. What voice ends up being the loudest at a given moment? There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of randomness to that. And oftentimes the answer comes from a small set of people.
I want to address Dragon Drop's question again, because again, his question is about what do you think needs to happen for Valve to change their focus. I think the only way you're really going to get that to happen is if Valve is somehow persuaded or adopts the view that it does help their game and their company to build a sustainable long-term ecosystem. And I could understand, honestly, I could understand if they don't feel that that's the case, because to them, you know, there's still people who are going to buy these in-game things. Whether or not the pro scene is stable or exists, players are, I get, in a sense, a promotional and like good marketing tool, but not necessarily the entire scene itself. So they may have already decided long ago, for all we know, that it's not actually worth it to put all these resources and man hours and time into building a sustainable long-term system, because maybe they just don't think they're going to benefit from that much, and so why would they do it?
And I don't think it has to be a binary thing, right? I mean, I've preached over and over again, if you look at how Valve is run, Valve is a software company. They're a company about making games. They happen to have invented a very, very lucrative digital distribution platform, and by and large, they have used the very large revenues from those digital distribution platforms to subsidize the making of games and now other hardware products. And that's how they see themselves. And Valve's always been a company about experimentation. They've always been a company about doing it their way. They're very proud. And over time, they've been right. And so I think Jack's probably right when he says, Valve isn't looking at Dota 2 as like Riot looks at League and says, this is our business, this is our way forward, we better keep this healthy. Valve looks at Dota 2 and goes, this is a game that we've made, we're going to make other successful games, and when this game becomes no longer worth our investment of work hours in it, we're going to move on to something else, and that's going to be successful too. Now, again, whether or not Artifact and whether or not how the index does in the next year or two is going to change that outlook. I don't know, but I you got to look at Valve and you just got to be realistic about what they are and who they are and how they make decisions. And I still think that we as a community have considerable power to shape what Valve does and to affect the attitude that they take toward the scene. But don't make Valve out to be anything other than what they've shown to be themselves as.
A game development corporation.
I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us are still going to buy that battle pass regardless of the situation, exactly. Right? How many of us are going to if you look at if it's about the player base, then there's certainly steps too, like whether it's the quality of player experiences, like people have been talking about that. I've anecdotally felt that my player experience in game has not been getting better, has been getting worse as well.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of other things. It could be promotion. Like we know that they have a very unique stance to promotion and marketing that other people don't. But at the end of the day, again, like you said, Nahaz, it could just very well be just a drop in a very large bucket for them. Unlike some of these other maybe companies where their lifeblood and their I don't want to say, but like the crux of their operation is whatever game they've put out. So they have to put everything into making that esport work, or they want some kind of long-term gain from that. It might just be that Valve doesn't have those views at all, and if that's the case, then yeah, we've got to you got to solve your own problems, I guess.
At the same time, though, I don't want people to hear that and think that I'm preaching doom and gloom and walk away and say, well, it's going to be fun while it lasts, right? Let's just buy our battle pass and enjoy it while we can. No, I actually think Valve is also invested in keeping all of us happy. But the point that I've been trying to preach for a long time is that we as a community, we just have to be smart. We have to be a little smarter than other communities where Riot's leading the shop. We have to realize that the decisions that we make have both short and long-term consequences. And we have to realize that, it may be the popular thing, for example, last year to say, oh, Facebook is evil and anybody in the world should be able to broadcast a game on their Twitch channel. And that's fine. I get that that's a popular thing, but at the same time, that's a decision that has long-term consequences. And we've got to be willing to have a dialogue about that and take an educated opinion. I mean, it's on all of us to try and do the right thing for this game. And I think we can do that. I mean, let's be frank, right? God, I've played Overwatch. We're a smarter community, but we got to be smart about this, guys.
Well, and the plea there is, we rag on Reddit a lot. We certainly criticize Reddit and social media and hive mind aspects. But I just want to say the last few Cooldown episodes that have gone on Reddit have had amazing discussion. It's been really great to see these different viewpoints and to see people really think about these problems. And the amazing thing there, and we sort of talked about it was off the air when we were filming this last Cooldown episode, was that there are these rational, reasonable people who love Dota that want to talk about these things waiting in the wings to see a post like that and comment. Just like everybody in chat asking these questions. And the reality is the more people are asking those questions, the more people are vocal and are active, you change the hive mind. You can make a difference. And it's a super cheesy way to go about this, but you really can actually make a difference with one well-placed Reddit thread or comment. And we know that that's what Valve looks at. I mean, that's been demonstrated again and again. So we can move on to another question after that little be good human beings on social media rant.
Shout out to Scant. I see them.
He's got a good question. That's the question I want to go to.
Oh, good stuff.
Yeah, so I think he's being a little snarky, but it's still a good one. If a team of 5 South Africans moved to another region and qualified for a DPC event, do you think Valve would have an issue with that? Should they, considering South Africans can't actually qualify from their own region?
Actually, for TI qualifiers, I don't recall last year, don't they list the exact countries to be considered parts of certain regions? I think they did for Europe and CS. I'm not sure if that was a Faceit thing or it was a Valve thing or what.
I think it is. I think it is a Faceit thing, and I've always had issue with that. To me, if you can get the money to get sponsored or go why the hell? A couple years ago, was it Infamous that got together and played the TI qualifiers from the Summit House after one of the tournaments? I
think so. Well, I think because
God bless you, man.
Because Summit had a late end tournament, and then the team just kind of stayed there and played from there or something.
Yeah, I don't see why that would be an issue. I think that the bar, again, the point of the dead horse in this case that I'll kick over and over again is I think that there need to be a clear set of criteria that are written down that one can look at before the damn qualifiers and say,
wait, Nahaz, are you saying you want a rule book?
Oh, gee. What a concept. But no, I don't have to me, the bar, and I think at least they've paid lip service to this idea. The bar ought to be, are you contributing to the Dota scene in that region? That means hopefully you're living there, but that means you're playing pubs there. That means you're participating in the scene as a member of that region. I have a problem with when I look up somebody's Dota buff and they are nominally playing for an NA team, and I see that 95% of their pub matches in the last, 3 months while they've been on that team and played events internationally with that team have been played in another region. I personally have a problem with that. I'm not saying that that's where the bar should be, but I think, again, the bar ought to be, are you a part of the Dota scene? Are you contributing to the Dota scene in this region? To me, that is right now largely about playing pubs. That's a big part of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where it gets really complicated, and I think we do respect that. A lot of times you want to go with the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, although there isn't really a fleshed out letter of the law. Just for instance, Adam, I think, according to the complexity, like apparently he couldn't enter. He hasn't been able to legally enter the region that he's qualifying from.
Yeah,
representing.
he's gotten really unlucky with a lot of visa issues, and
Yeah.
I deliberately didn't mention him by name because I'm familiar with that situation. But yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, that would be an example. I'd say for their team, but yet at the same time they have someone. Cole has Limp, who I would consider to be. I would say that you can count this guy as an NA player because
Absolutely.
he's lived and competed in North America for the last 2 years, and
Very
so
long time.
regardless of like citizenship or whatever, it's a matter of where you draw those boundaries as long as the spirit of the law works. Obviously, for just to answer Scan's question specifically, I mean, yeah, I'm sure if their region doesn't actually exist, they should be able to kind of exercise that ability to qualify from somewhere. And then I guess the gray area, or what he's kind of getting at, is if they choose a region that isn't geographically close to theirs, but one that they consider maybe the weakest, or they have no intention of ever staying in or contributing to, or have no means of doing
If
that.
they
Would
can,
that
if
still
they
be
can
okay?
pay for a team house in Peru or Brazil and go play there for a month or two, I don't. I don't know. Look, here's one more quick thing. Okay, it's a little bit philosophical, but I think it's important to say this. When I say I want a rule book, no set of written rules for any competitive league I'm aware of is exhaustive. Mm-hmm. Saying you want a rule book does not mean that there needs to be a rule that 100% black and white decides every single possible case. The whole point, or a large part of the point of rules to me, is to spell out as much as possible what that spirit of the competition is. What are we supposed to be shooting for? Okay? If you read the Major League Baseball rule book carefully enough, and you go through all the contingencies and you go through all this legal speak, the definition of a strike in Major League Baseball is what the home plate umpire says it is. At the end of the day, that is it. It is spelled out in the rules that it's a judgment call. The point is, there are thousands of words before that of guidelines about what we're supposed to be shooting for. Like the whole, when you see baseball on TV, oh, that was below the knees, that's not a strike. Bullshit. A strike is what the umpire said it is. Now, however, we have all these rules to clarify this is supposed to be the ideal. This is supposed to be what we're shooting for. And the problem, when you look at these DPC decisions, it's not always obvious what we're shooting for, okay? That's partly what, let's write down a set of rules that spells all this out. What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to promote here? It doesn't have to be 100% black and white. There can be judgment calls. I want to know, at the end of the day, when the Faceit admins are writing Valve and saying, should we disqualify this team at this point in the TI qualifiers? I want to have something there besides, well, make a decision that sounds good and we'll either approve it or not.
And those teams should know ahead of time before they try and qualify.
Yes. There ought to be something you can do before the fact to assess the risk of, are we going to get qualified? Because guys, I know, and I'm not trying to call out Valve here. I'm not trying to shit on Valve. But I know for a fact that there have been situations where people have tried to contact Valve and say, is this okay? And haven't been able to get an answer before the fact. So it's not, and that's going to happen. Okay, it's a big system. There's a lot of correspondence that needs to be addressed. It's part of the reason why I do, along with rules, I think we need some more sort of formal leadership structure rather than email valvesoftware.com. Okay.
Well, I think this is going to segue nicely into another question. So as Nahaz was going on, he said, one of the things we lack without a rule book is there's no idea of what our goals are. The goals are all over the place, and so it's hard to follow the spirit of a law if you don't even know what the spirit is intending.
Right.
And the only thing we really do know is that TI is above all sacred, and everything is TI, and TI is all that there is. And we've discussed it. That's definitely a problem, having that mindset, because it makes a lot of things very challenging to work out. And so I have no idea how to say your name, dude, but Elgco, Gecko, something like that. Could the ecosystem as a whole benefit from TI being a biannual event? So this is thinking CSGO majors, or even potentially what Valve was trying with DAC and TI. So if we saw some kind of double TI rather than single, would that benefit, or would that be too much shaken to the core of what Dota is?
Depends what you mean. I think we argued on the previous pod about how we feel that redistributing some of that, or some of the importance or incentives of TI would be helpful to the ecosystem as a whole. I think for biannual, I mean, you'd have to determine what that means. Are you just going to split the prize pool into 2 tournaments? Are you going to have, the details do kind of matter. But I think if the general concept is that it would probably help a lot of actors in the scene if you redistributed some of the TI, I guess, rewards. Yeah, I think we're firmly a yes on that. Beyond that, I don't know. It would depend on the details, I guess.
Yeah, well, and he's amended the question to say every 2 years to spread out DPC events.
Yeah, I think either way you put that question, okay, there's no putting this particular genie back in the bottle. I mean, TI is so deeply woven into the fabric of our community identity. I just don't think you can do that at this point. It's not worth discussing because it's not realistic. Now, I think what Jack was referring to, that I've made this statement a million times. There are a lot of different ways to achieve it, but I think the number one thing you talk about when you want the Dota scene to be better and more stable is there need to be less emphasis on 2 particular weeks of the year and more emphasis on the remaining 50. And, and I think it's telling too, talking to Richard Lewis, talking to some other talent in the CSGO scene, is that, historically, CSGO talent at times have been very jealous of TI and saying, why don't we have that? As this major system that they currently have has come into its own, I'm hearing more and more. They're like, no, we're good. We're good.
And they know their dates for years in advance.
Again, we talked about that on the pod too. That's that is a huge deal. That when you talk about that, people don't realize how much of a difference that makes cost-wise to these tournament organizers. That you're able to plan, dates X in advance, and you're able to promote, and not just the forward-facing public advertising component, but in terms of the search for sponsors, you're going behind the scene. You're saying, look, we're going to have a tournament a year from now on this date. It's going to be a DPC event. Secret and Liquid are going to be there, etc. I mean, that's a thing. And again, it is important too that when people with a little bit of knowledge of economics and business behind the scene start talking about events, they start talking about selling individual events. Whereas as I'm looking at esports more and more in the business side, it's becoming more and more about selling a portfolio of events and even different titles to people, saying, look, if you're giving us this amount of money, we're going to be able to get your brand identity out in front of these different communities in these different ways. I mean, look at what HyperX has this tremendous ad campaign going right now, where they've got Gordon Hayward, they've got Post Malone, they got Shroud and Pokemon. That's where esports is going, to me, is the recognition that, you don't, nobody knows how to pick a title right now. Great. Give me a portfolio. Diversification is king. Okay. But it's just really hard to do that when we're not finding about TI dates. We're not finding about TI dates until a couple months beforehand. We're not finding about the dates of a major that's supposed to be this November. We're finding out in May. That's got to change. We've got to have some more clarity.
Now, I know, I think I already know your guys' answer to this because we did discuss it a little bit on the episode, but it was a interesting point made on Reddit, and then it was just something asked again in chat by Judo. Should any competently run tournament be non-DPC in the first place? Why not make everything DPC? And the Reddit suggestion was, let's give a smaller amount of points to non-major minor tournaments and make them count again, so we don't have the ESL Mumbai scenario. So my question here is, in the cooldown, we discussed how last year the system was better. It just needed a little bit of tweaking, scheduling-wise, really. My question would be, because of how top-heavy this year's teams have been, I think that if you were not careful about your point distribution to other tournaments, you could have smaller teams end up at TI without a significant DPC presence. Yes or no?
Again, that is a point that people kept making to me last year, right after the system was announced, and I just didn't see it, man. I mean, you looked at it. First of all, the big complaint and the reason why we scaled back from last year was a lot of teams like Liquid, not putting anything on them in particular, but there were a lot of teams that said, look, there are just too many events, and we feel obligated to play all of them. And, my response was, I think that was more a lack of guidance being given and nobody going to point out to these teams, look, the points are backloaded toward the end of the system. You don't have to play every event. We're not expecting teams to play every event. This is about how many points we think people are going to need to qualify TI,
but Jack,
TI, et cetera, et cetera.
If Nahaz came to you as your statistical analysis for your team's likelihood of getting to TI and said, listen, the points are backloaded, don't stress yourself out, don't play all these events, would you listen? Would your players listen? Or would they sign up for every single goddamn thing they could that had points on it?
You'd probably still sign up for everything you can because TI is just that important. I think
it's important, but
I mean, it might help. It might help a little bit. I mean, yeah, it would probably help a little bit. But here's the problem with the DPC cat in the bag. Like once it happens, there is one good reason for it, and one of the many good reasons for it is that if you just try to attach points values to third-party tournaments, it's very difficult to do this in a fair way because like one of the things that you could do with DPC is you have to control for access and opportunity, right? Like you have to guarantee slots per region. You have to make sure that smaller teams or teams with less recognition or newer teams have the same opportunity to compete for slots and points as everyone else. That's when the cat's kind of out of the bag with DPC. So either you had a system like before where the selection process for TI and invites is more subjective and less like clearly known and transparent, and then you can go back and weigh like teams' performance by quality of competition, by things like that, or you have to do it this way where you try to slap an objective standard on things and you have to ensure that everyone has access. So that's why you can't just assign an arbitrary value of DPC points to third-party tournaments because you just don't know what the field will be. You don't know who gets a chance to play in those. And if it's too little, then it doesn't really make any difference whether you play in those at all. And if it's too much, then it's just very unfair.
Look at minors this year. I mean, I still don't fully understand why we have, DPC points attached to minors this year when it's just
mean nothing
compared to the majors. It's just like a token amount, and people are still saying things like, well, what if teams? That's not going to happen, man.
You have to win all 5 minors, pretty much, and then not place any higher at the major.
Yeah, and a team that has one top 6 at a major still, like, come on, it's what I think. What I would like to see happen again is you take everybody was upset, and this is the reason why we have this kind of cluster F this year, where everybody has to play in every major qualifier. I think you take the top. My preferred number is 4, but name a smaller number if you want. 2 is fine. Okay. From the previous
I even saw
major,
someone
you guarantee
suggest
them,
6.
and then you work to have a feeder system where Valve sits down far in advance of the season and says, okay, who's going to host a tournament? In order to host a Dota tournament next year, Valve, having unlimited dictatorial power, says, if you want to host a Dota tournament next year with a prize pool in excess of $100,000, you have to send us your idea when it's going to be. I want to see the schedule. Get it up there now. Okay, fine. We all do that. Valve says, okay, here are going to be the tournaments that are majors. Goes and says, do you have the ability to scale the tournament up? Can you make it a major? Do we trust you, etc.? And then the non-major tournaments, the winners of those get a spot at the major or a spot at the minor, however you want to do it. You try and integrate the system. It doesn't have to be points. I think for what it's worth, and I've already said this, I think what we did last year was fine. And I think another iteration would have removed a lot of the kinks. I don't mind putting everybody on a level playing field and saying, look, you want a DPC event? You're a DPC event. Problems with that? Fine, let's go fix them. But I don't think like having non-minors be a tier lower than minors, especially at anything close to the current point allocation, is going to fix the problem.
There were some things last year that were kind of fixed or addressed. Just bringing up like points, for instance. Again, the first major of the season was an 8-team tournament.
Yes.
With one slot to China, one slot to NA, it was worth a major. And then you have Genting, which was a 16-team tournament, yet worth a minor. So those things can be ironed out. That
was the same organization that hosted those two events, and that happened because that event was already planned before.
Yeah, not exactly the same organization.
And Valve said, and what?
Not exactly the same organization. No, he's talking about the Dream League Major and ESL1 Genting.
ESL1 Hamburg to ESL1 Genting.
Oh, I was doing the Dream League Major to ESL1 Genting.
Okay, so I thought, well, sorry if I misread you there, Jack. I'm sorry, but here's the point, right? That happened, and that is a very common complaint or criticism that I heard from a lot of people. That happened because ESL1 Hamburg had already been planned, because as I've said a million times now, ESL has to plan events longer than 6 months out. It's more like for ESL, it's much more on the flip side at 12. Guys, like that happened because Hamburg had already been planned, and Valve said, oh, hey, you want to host a major? ESL said, sure, we'd like to host it here. They're like, well, we need one in November. And they were like, okay. I mean, they weren't going to say no to the opportunity to hold the first major, but that event was an 8-team event with the constraints that Jack mentioned, precisely because it was planned before it was clear to anybody that there was going to be a DPC at all. Yeah,
there was another issue last season that I think kind of speaks to Judo's question and was partially addressed as well. And there's another challenge for just giving DPC points at third-party tournaments, and that's how the qualifier system is going to work. Because even though, so last season you started to see there were standardized kind of qualifier, like there's a minimum of slots, although some of it was still left up to organizers' discretion. And what ended up happening from the team point of view is that the organizers would either fight each other for some of the dates, or they would make certain allowances or changes for certain teams that came at the cost of other teams. Like, it's not even about they do it for Team A but not for Team B. It's they want Team A wants a change and they agree to do it without everyone being unanimously aboard. And maybe it screws over someone else's qualifier or it screws over someone else's team. Bad. Right. We had a situation that came up where we would have had to play possibly 2 best-of-5 grand finals in one day, or one of them after the next major, because someone else had made a commitment to another team to allow them to play in a different qualifier. So that's the other challenge, and that's something that having qualifier dates has gone towards helping to address in a way. So
that was kind of, that's been another of my big talking points all along, is that we need active monitoring. And if we're going to call, especially if there's only going to be 5 of them in a year, if we're going to call these majors and minors, Valve needs to take an active role and be a true underwriter of these events, not just putting up half the prize pool. Like, I'm sorry, but if what happened with GESC last year were to happen again this year, I would expect to be paid by Valve. I'm going to put that, I think, Jack, the teams got paid eventually, right? No? Okay.
Not to my knowledge.
Where's that? I mean, honestly, that was a DPC event. We are starting tomorrow. 2 of them, yeah. We are starting tomorrow, going to be, as a community, pouring millions of dollars out of our wallets into a battle pass, 75% of it is going to be taken as profit by Valve. Okay, pay the teams and pay the talent for those events before you pocket that profit. Before even, hey, I know sacrilege, maybe even before it goes into the TI prize pool. That's what I'm saying, is that we need some entity that is going to be making decisions holistically with the interest of the system. And by the way, I saw one really smart comment in chat that says, if you basically said, if you want to elevate these other DPC events, it doesn't have to be about points. Money talks too. Mm-hmm. And one of the pathways forward that I can see that we talked about in the pod is elevating some of these, is restoring some of these revenue channels, like the ability to sell customized cosmetics, like team banners, and making those available to third parties again. Like, we had wonderful tournaments, like some of the summits, like the captain's draft event. I still use that jug set occasionally. It's not about points. It's about, does this become part of the storyline of the season? Is this something that people remember? Very true. If we think of the first Epicenter, no one is ever going to forget the intro to that tournament. I mean, right. that was, and no one ever forgets the summits. And unfortunately, the summits struggle to exist currently, for sure. So there's been a lot of questions about how do we make less of the focus on TI? How do we, and I think that, pouring more money in helps, but really, is there any way to take a step back? Like, would capping the prize pool ruin the magic? I am against a hard cap. Mm-hmm. But I am against a hard cap. But I would be, if Valve wanted to change the split from 70, 20, 10 and tell me that, 20% of the prize pool, 20% of that money that I spend from 75, 25 to 70, 20, 10, and tell me that 20% of the money that I spent on my battle pass this year is going to go toward TI, and 10% is going to be split evenly among DPC majors or something like that next year, I'm not going to have a problem with that. And again, it doesn't have to be all about points. It doesn't have to be all about money. What it does need to be about is equalizing the distribution of resources, not equalizing, but doing a better job of distributing more evenly the resources, both financial and non-financial, from one tournament in a year to a lot of other tournaments that occur the rest of the year. Jack, what's the player perspective when that happens? Because the players, TI is everything. So what happens when you take something away from TI? Would they be happy because they say, oh, that's more of a chance for us to get money? Because the impression I get is that players are gamblers. And you want to take the biggest risk for the biggest payout. And you also want the ego.
Again, this is something that it kind of depends who you ask, and it depends what the alternative is, right? I think for most players or people who maybe want to play the game professionally, or see it as a long-term possibility where they're willing to spend a year or two or a few years working and trying to improve and trying to reach that point, then yes, that would be tremendously helpful to them, because it doesn't really take much away from TI being the crown jewel and the grand prize. It's still going to be there. If you had a TI that was 15 million or even less or whatever it is, it would still be by far the biggest event of the year. It would still be, by far the most prestigious. It would still, in a large sense, make or break careers and reputations and all that. The stakes would still be tremendously high and higher than anything else. I think you would have to take a significant majority chunk out of TI to make that not the case. So I don't think that part's ever really in danger. But then it just depends, how you want to distribute things. Like, whether you can have this argument about whether DPC points are being distributed the right way for finishes at tournaments. Is that too top heavy as well? For prizes, you can make the argument that maybe if you put more towards qualifiers, then it encourages more people to try to give it a shot. Maybe it rewards people who are just kind of at that barely professional level. There's a lot of, it really depends how exactly you would see this being done. But I think, again, for the vast majority of players and for people who would consider either giving it a shot or wanting to play more seriously, then yeah, that would definitely be helpful to them to not have such a concentration.
I mean, I think in economics we talk a lot about something called the selection effect, and I think that that's definitely true here. That I mean, Dota is a very stressful game. It's a game for very intense people with a lot of mental energy, and I think Dota selects for people that are hardcore competitors and that are gonna be able to believe that they're gonna win TI and are gonna wanna, it selects for those of us that love to reach for that brass ring and are willing to live with the fact that most of the time we're going to fall on our face. Okay. To me, I think that there are a lot of different ways to do this. There's not one right answer here, but I do worry. We're at the point right now. I think the trend is going in the wrong direction. All right. As I said on the pod, we need to make some decisions about how many teams do we want the Dota 2 scene to be able to support? How many players do we think ought to be able to play Dota 2 as a full-time job? Because we're in a situation, if you look at TI being conservatively 2/3, probably more like 3/4, depending on how the Battle Pass does, of the total prize money available throughout the season. And if you use the last 3 years of payout structures as a guide, the top 4 teams get almost 80%. So right there, you are looking at a system where by construction, 20 players are going to end up with at least half of all the prize money. And the distribution, the tails remain steep after that initial fall off as well. Right now, we're in a position where there aren't too many more than 10 to 12 teams where these young men that are playing our game that are very talented, that do have other outside opportunities. You're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 24 teams that are going to be able to afford to play professionally as a full-time job over a long period of time. And that's what I think we got to change. And the other thing I worry about, it's a delicate scale. Economic problems like this are full of non-linearities. It's a delicate scale. I think you maintain a certain level of interest in Dota throughout the year. It doesn't have to be that high, and TI remains the crown jewel, and it can survive a big gap there. But I do think that there's some critical point where if the interest in Dota for the rest of the year falls off sufficiently, if we fall to a point where we can't support more than 10 or 12 teams, I think you're going to start to see all of a sudden that crown jewel is going to start to show some cracks and show some blemishes. And that's what I worry about a lot about. We need to make a decision as a community. What do we want our non-TI events to look like? Because we've gone from two or three $3 million majors to one season of $9 million majors plus and 13 minors to now 5 $1 million majors and 5 minors. The trend is not going in the right direction.
This is going to link to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jack.
No, I just want to say that same question that you asked at the beginning. You could apply that very same question to everyone else, right? Like, how many talent should be able to do this professionally in this season? How many organizers should be able to survive and be able to? That's a question that applies to. Sorry, Vanessa. Go ahead.
No, it's good. So this was a question I really liked. Another one from Funk Doctor. Can Dota be sold to younger players, or is it doomed to be like horse racing or boxing with an agent stagnant viewer base? And specifically, I want to touch on what Jack said about adding more money to qualifiers, because we need more Sumails, 15-year-old stars who play mid-acts and absolutely own in a $3 million tournament, and show off Storm Spirit to the world and everything. How many more of those are we going to have when you look at, say, Fortnite, which is much easier to get into and has much more money spread around, and then you look at Dota and you go, wow, I have to be a top 100 player to even earn a little bit of money. I have to be a top 50, 30 player to make these big paydays. So I think the question there is, if we saw more money distributed to qualifiers or somehow battle cups and didn't have bot abuse, or, you know, there was some way to distribute a smaller amount of money, do you think we would see more younger players actually playing?
I think this is a two-part question. I think first,
N-part question.
For player experience, I mean, those of us who are here, I'm sure we all agree that Dota is a wonderful game. Like with all games, when the game's been out for a while and, you know, there's a lot of knowledge available and people get better, the people who still play, it's going to be harder for newer players to come in and still have a fun experience. And that's a multi-pronged thing. That's being able to play the game itself. That's being able to feel a sense of competitiveness or progress. Not everyone is going to be willing to slog through this just getting destroyed and getting flamed by everyone. Like, that's very off-putting to most casual players. So I think that part needs to be tackled to at least some extent, so that you know, people can come in and play, because that part only gets harder, right? I look at like any sport or whatever. Like, yeah, I'm sure the people who are good enough to play, you know, college basketball or high school basketball now compared to like 30, 40, 50 years ago are way better. But can you still get into the game, enjoy the game, watch the game, play the game yourself? Like, is that barrier still there? And this is also a complicated issue because it's different in different regions. In China, for instance, it is much harder to play Dota than it is to play League of Legends. A lot of places that you go to, the sign-up process is harder. You need to provide more information. A lot of the computers don't even have it. There's no promotions that exist at like the PC cafes and stuff, compared to League of Legends, which with Tencent as their overseer is like vertically integrated, you know, and integrated with promotion and with PC cafes to an insane degree. So yes, it's harder for people to get into that game. The game itself I think it obviously has way more than enough depth and replay value and interesting elements to be something that people should come to and should stick to. And here's the thing, I always make this point about China. You know, when I go to a PC cafe in China, it feels like half the people there are still playing Dota 1. It's like the concept, the idea, the game itself is still like those people were on the Dota tree. Like, it's still such a great game. And you can also make the argument, depending on where you stand, that Dota has survived and thrived maybe in spite of its lack of promotion, and things like that, versus, you know, so yeah, that starts to get a little complicated, a couple of separate arguments. But yeah, I think the game should still be able to do pretty well. I think some changes have to be made to kind of protect new players and their experience and allow them to experience the part of the game that hooks them and that gets them in, like it did for all of us. I don't really think it's like an age-specific thing, and I think that it's been a little overblown, this idea that MOBAs aren't fun or just like out of date or whatever. I don't agree with that, because I think there's a very unique
100%.
strategic and play experience that MOBAs give you that, you know, other genres of games don't.
So
I mean, if StarCraft 2 is like reinvigorating and still going strong, I think MOBAs are doing great.
Right. I don't think there's any. Yeah, I think the whole like MOBAs are destined to fade away argument is just it's a complete non-starter, and it just goes against any number of empirical phenomena you want to document. But I want to, because this is, as Jack said, this is like a, you know, two-part question. This is like a jillion-part question. I just want to iterate on a couple of aspects that Jack suggested. And number one being that it is a point of, I do think it's a legitimate point of concern that, you know, the new player experience in some ways is destined to get more difficult over time. But particularly in the last year or so, I just start to get real concerned because the hardcore players, a lot of the guys that I know that for better or worse are going to, you know, they're going to be playing Dota until the servers go kaput. And so many of them are telling me that their play experience, and not all of these are like at the divine level, okay, or like at the 100 rank level. You know, a lot of the guys I know that are like 4 or 3K even are telling me that, you know, the play experience has not been getting better. Again, the trend going in the wrong direction is what a lot of this comes back to. And, you know, I do think there needs to be more effort put into the new player experience, you know, not just limited to a tutorial, but for the love of God, there needs to be one that's better than what we've got now. A structured bot game experience, for example. Now that we have, you know, OpenAI and all that, how about we have a version of OpenAI that's specifically tailored to teach Dota rather than just to win at Dota? I think that should be coming in the near term, or it should be possible even with what we've got right now. You know, the other thing that Jack said that I think is really important is that, you know, we did a podcast and we're doing a show about the DPC. And there are a lot of parts of that particular question that fall outside the realm of just the competitive Dota scene. There are a lot of things that need to be done about the game to keep it relevant and to keep it growing and to keep it where we want to be. Not all of those are addressable by the competitive scene. There's nothing that we can do to pro Dota that's going to help it compete with Fortnite. All right. And there's arguably, we can argue about whether it should even be trying. All right. What I will say is that I do think that there's some complementarities. There's a very powerful externalities that can be exploited. What I see in other scenes that have more of an org-friendly focus is it is those organizations that know that they need to reach a younger audience, not just in this game, but in a lot of different games. And you can piggyback on. That's part of why when I first was talking about OWL, I think OWL's approach to branding is in some way a mistake. I don't think you want to divorce your audience from audiences in other esports titles, because I do think it's smaller, okay, than in a lot of traditional sports aspects. Like, there's no, in esports, there's not yet an equivalent of, I went to Duke, so I root for Duke basketball and I also root for Duke football. Like there's not that in esports yet, but I don't think that means that we might not eventually get there. And I do think that by having organizations involved in the scene, that are a lot of what we're seeing in Dota right now is that there are very little incentives for players and teams to develop their brand. That in terms of the brass ring in Dota is winning tournaments and making a bunch of prize money. Okay? We don't have enough people thinking about, how is this going to advance my career when I stop playing? How can I build brand equity for my personal brand and for my team? Those are the kinds of things that stand the test of time and that spill over and help you to attract different audiences and younger viewers. That's where I think we can make some progress here in considering the DPC.
So we're going to do one more question, I think, because we've definitely kind of run the gambit on everything here. Which, there's a lot of things to discuss with Overwatch and regionality and fan bases and what's going to happen with Call of Duty and losing their cross branding. So that's a separate show. Before we get into all of that. But one last question. I'm going to assume it's What the Duck, although I didn't listen to this one, so I don't know. But Yoho says, in a recent podcast, Sunsfan said that Valve employees don't like working on TI, and he has a theory that the 10th TI will come back to NA, and it will be the last. What do you think about that? And there's a part of me that kind of would love to see TI disappear, because I don't think third-party tournaments would go anywhere. And I think suddenly advertisers would be a lot more relevant. I'm just concerned about losing our sparkle. But I don't know. What do you guys think? What would happen? Valve hates TI. It's too much work. They're going to give us 10 of them and then move on. What happens?
So a couple things there. I believe that he's correct for a lot of them not liking to work on TI, because frankly, it's probably not a good use of their direct time and resources. Like anecdotally, the first TI I went to was TI6, and I remember helping to unbox computers and stuff. And you got the guy who designed Quake or something. It's like, should that guy be spending his time unboxing computers with me? Probably not. Or should that guy be in the booth refereeing games? Probably not. Not a good use of his time. So that makes sense. I mean, there was a situation then where they'd bring the whole army down, or a big part of the army down, kind of from their headquarters. So yeah, I agree that that's not efficient. That's not the best use of their resources. But however, if you look at TIs after that, I think to a large extent, they've kind of been willing to be more trusting and outsource more of that to other organizers and to other people to help them bear the burden. So last year, I believe PGL was running a large part of the tournament and production. This season, you've got Perfect World and you're in China. So I think that's so I don't think that alone would cause CI to stop happening. It would just look different or be different than when Valve was directly in charge of it. So yeah. And that just makes sense.
I do think there's something to what Shannon said. Like I have heard those same, you hear those same whispers. Part of the reason that we're on the path that we're on for TI, some years back, I forget what year it was. I think it was before TI5. Valve actually had several tournament organizers. I know MLG was included. I believe ESL was included. And they got a bunch of TOs together. They said, look, that was, I think, TI4 was the first one in Key, right? Yeah. TI4 was the first one in Key. They did that. They realized, gosh, this is a much bigger event now. We need all hands on deck, and we're asking people that spend the rest of their year as software developers doing completely unrelated things to come in and work on this huge-ass tournament. It's weird. So they put out the contract, and they said, okay, MLG, ESL, give us bids to host Dota. And I, have it on good authority, was having a beer to one of the guys that made the pitch, that MLG came in and they put on a big pitch, started telling, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to have the stage here. We're going to set things up like this. And the reaction in the room of Valve people was, no, we want this way. No, we want this done this way. No, we want the stage facing this way. No, we want, and the MLG guys kind of looked at each other and went, we put on esports tournaments for a living. We're not going to put our people in a position where they have to be micromanaged by a company who's in a different line of business. And that was part of why PGL has worked, and they've done great work at TI. Part of why PGL has worked is that PGL is a relatively small company. They are very, very small in scale compared to ESL, MLG, et cetera. Now, they've grown a lot, but certainly if you compare to where they were when they started working with Valve, around the time of the Manila Major and before. That's still, again, we're still in the situation where PGL is nominally now taking over TI, but it's still uncomfortably close to an all hands on deck situation at Valve. And you still have a very large number of people at Valve that have to work on TI that have no contact with Dota for the remainder of the season. And that's what I'm saying. I have for years argued with, I do think TI should be more outsourced than it is, right? Valve works with PGL because they're a very smart company and they're nimble enough to do some of their own production, but still let Valve have their way about most things that Valve cares about. And I do think over time, it's going to make sense. You can stay with PGL and have them get bigger. You can maybe bring somebody else in, but I do agree with Shannon that it's not going to make sense to go back to this model where TI is in the States. It's potentially this huge tournament, and random people at Valve are still responsible for taking computers out of boxes. That's not economic value to me.
It's a great story,
think the
though.
model needs to change. I hope he's wrong about the outcome. Okay, and I don't see, like, again, people make a lot about Twitch views and money and trends like that. I don't see economically that, we've got 2 more TIs in us and then it's going to be on live sport. No, I think we can keep going as a scene, but that's part of why I'm really passionate right now. I think if we're gonna keep going as a scene past TI10, that the structural changes that are going to carry us past that point, now is the time that we need to think about those. And now is the time that we need to evolve into a sustainable ecosystem that's going to make sense for them to keep everything going past that point.
I want to add something to that based on what you guys have been saying, as well as some comment I just saw where Storm Shadow 25 said Valve already has a passionate community with experts from all areas who are ready to organize and perfect the DPC feature to it too. Just hire them to do it for you. Here's the problem though, or here is likely the problem, as with TI and the other things that you've mentioned, where there's still a direct hand in it. It's because ultimately whatever happens needs to benefit Valve.
Absolutely.
And there's no reason for Valve or anybody for that matter to trust that people outside of their company or organization are going to be thinking and incentivizing in terms of what is optimal for them. And so just based on that alone, I think that it's very unlikely to see it go to that point, to see it go to that extent where people are significantly empowered to directly significantly empowered to try and deal with the scene. I think, I just think based on that, it's just unlikely.
I think at some point there needs to be, again, if you look at all of the competitive systems that have worked, all of the major sports leagues that I know of, there's been some entity that is explicitly charged in its responsibilities with the long-term health of the game. I don't think you can continue to have Valve sort of show up to TI, do the battle pass, take their money, make us all happy, and then sort of fade into the background, as it were, for the remaining 50 weeks of the year. I don't think that's sustainable, because eventually, that TI revenue is going to fluctuate. And if we get into this system where one year that check comes in too small and it's not worth our time anymore, I think we're in a great deal of trouble. I do think that there needs to be, Valve does need to be a little forward looking at this point and say, call it what you want, a commissioner's office, whatever, but there needs to be somebody out there whose job description is think about the long-term viability of the scene. And that long-term viability, I am including long-term profitability in that. I am going to be the last person that is going to ask Valve or any other company to do something that is against its economic interests. I would not feel any passion about this whatsoever if I were not convinced that the economic calculus is workable, that there is a way to do a sustainable system that may not be as profitable in the short run, but that is going to create a hell of a lot of long-term economic value for everybody included, and Valve is at the top of that list.
So to close us out, because I think we've hit a lot of questions here, and if you have any remaining ones, I would recommend watching the last podcast as well, because a lot of these questions have kind of touched on that. For those of you who are regulars of the cooldown, you know that I always end with kind of more of a personal question about what stories people are paying attention to or what they would want to see happen. And this time I want to have a little fun with it. One-on-one with Gabe Newell. He's a genie. Or your genie wish is that he answers one question honestly for you. You get one harsh, honest answer from Gabe Newell. What do you sit down and ask him? And I'm going to screw both of you over, because my question, because I get to go first, so that this is so that they have time to think. I'm totally being nice about this and not taking what I think is the best question here. How much does Valve care? I want to know. How much do they really care, and how much do they just want to shut people up?
You just took the best question.
I told you, that's why I'm going first.
She really didn't. There's a very, very old rule that I think we're forgetting here, and that is, do not ask a question that you do not want to know the answer to. Honestly, my own question would be really like, what's the 10-year plan? Like, what is the 10-year strategic plan for Valve as a company? Where do you see yourself? How has Artifact informed or changed that business model? How are you positioning the index strategically as a product? Where do you see your revenue split going forward? Do you think that how are we going to recap the tremendous pressure on margins that the increased digital competition to Steam is going to realize? I think that there are going to be, I may sit down in a couple of years and write a business school case on Valve. I think that what you see Valve, like the couple of years leading up to now, and then the next couple of years, I think that there are going to be different business school cases written on Valve, because they are tremendously interesting. They're a private company. They're a highly successful private company. There are people, very smart people, not just in the gaming industry, who have suggested to me it's possible that Valve has been one of the more profitable companies in the country on a per employee basis. Like, it's a very, very interesting company for a business perspective, but right now they're facing huge challenges to their business model, and I'm not sure where they're going. And I'm not, barring blockbuster success in China, which is not out of the realm of possibility, I don't think stay the course, except for that scenario, is going to be an option for them. And so I want to know where they're going, because that to me will then have a lot of implications for the space of available outcomes for Dota.
All right, Jack. I clearly stole your question. Nahaz had about 100 of them. So what, Gabe Newell, one question. What do you want to know? You can give us a Sir Action Slack style answer. That's fine too.
Yeah, Jack, you had to watch those panels today, right, Jack?
I am stumped because I was both listening to what Alan was saying and tilted that you stole my question, and desperately trying to think of another question at the same time. And then I did try to think of something trolly, but do you? I don't know. Yeah, I can't think of a question that I would care more about more than yours. And that's just like, where do you see Dota, or what do you see Dota as? Because, personally, I don't really have too much of an interest in other games. I haven't really played other games. Like this game for the time being is my life, basically. So I don't play as much as I used to, but I'm mainly concerned with this. So Alan's question though is also, it's also very very important, because the artifact thing is something that people think about too, right? Was there something there that maybe changed their philosophy on things, that maybe changed how they evaluated these markets or these games? Maybe another tangential question is, is the marketplace just going to shift? Is China going to be the main focus or game plan for the next 10, 20 years as the Chinese middle class and those disposable income becomes available?
Which you got to be. There are a lot. That's the thing. There are a lot of people out there betting on that, and I think those aren't necessarily bad bets, but I do think that they need to be hedged, and how to hedge them is not a trivial question. Now, it really struck me though what Jack just said. Right, there are a hell of a lot of people out there that I know that I consider to be very smart and very exceptional people, that Dota is it's a huge part of their lives, and it is for me too. And I don't play much anymore. I don't play much Dota at all anymore, but this game still, it challenges me, because I still look at a lot of analytics. I still watch, I still probably have watched every replay of every DPC game this year at least once, if not live. And the game still challenges me like nothing else ever has. I mean, I quit baseball statistics and college basketball statistics as I got bored, and I thought that most of the questions that were being asked, research questions were being asked in those fields, were just too esoteric at that time. NBA stats have taken off, but I try to get into other stuff, and I just can't. Like, this is a game that every time I go back to it, I'm just driven to understand it. It's awesome, but it's not going to sustain itself. Somebody has to be in charge of stewardship for Dota. And I worry that Valve's incentives right now are not such that they're necessarily going to be looking at the long term for the scene. And that's not to say Valve is bad or evil. That's just what it is.
Yeah, that they have other interests. And I think that ultimately ends us on, I'll share with Jack on our question. How much does Valve care? So thank you everyone for joining us here on the live stream, or if you're listening later on many different podcast sites or watching on YouTube, feel free to ask more questions. Nahaz is great about reading through comments, and so we'll be there to answer more of your questions. As always, thank you for joining us. Please remember that things like likes, comments, shares, reviews, all those things really help other people find this, and maybe Valve find it and make some great changes. But this was our first Rivalry Cooldown AMA. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you thought, and we look forward to seeing you guys on our next episode. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Help keep
Thank you
Dota
so
alive, guys.
And thanks for thanks for just being a part of the discussion. Just having this discussion out there and talking about some of these issues, I think, is potentially a good thing in and of itself. So lots of love.
All right. Bye, everyone.